today is sponsored by Pennington Seed, and we appreciate that sponsorship. Dr. Bouton.
Thank you, John. Is this on? Can you hear me? All right, great.
No.
No? I'm pretty sure it's on. Is that right? I'll just start yelling. I thought it was, yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you. When my daughter was about 5 or 6 years old, somebody asked her, "What does your daddy do?" And she said, "He's a doctor, but he can't help you." So hopefully at the end here that I've helped a few of y'all. I got this picture right here. It's I'm not going to say much about it right now. There's a subliminal message here that hopefully you've picked up on already. Hint, those are actual sheep under there. I was fortunate to be asked by Don Ball and Gary Lacefield, you heard Gary's mentioned name, of course you knew Vivian Allen and my old colleague Carl Hovland, to write a book on concepts, forage concepts, but also by using some quotes from people, not just forage people, but people like Einstein and Mark Twain, and then tie a forage concept to it. So there's two quotes here that I want to use that's going to run like a steel rod through this talk. The first one is, people need to be reminded much more than they need to be instructed. Dr. Samuel Johnson, 1700s. If you think about that, it's so true. If it's not true, every one of our mothers was wrong. I don't know how many times my mother taught me how to do a chore or something. She taught me only a few times, but she nagged me 1,000 times. Okay? So I'm going to be nagging y'all. You're going to hear me say things that John said and that Glenn said, but we're just reminding you. The second one is a little more controversial. Toxic endophytes are bad, even evil. I'll let that hang out there for a while. So, but anyhow, as Glenn showed you, Kentucky 31 really was a driver for us to where by 1973, there were about 40 million acres of fescue planted for turf, erosion control, just general use, pastures for sure. But you got to remember why they did it. What was going on in this main region? Erosion was running crazy. I mean, it was washing off everything. So between trees, revegetating with trees, revegetating with grasses, especially Kentucky 31, we stopped a lot of gullies. So Kentucky 31, we're going to condemn it. In fact, I'm going to condemn it the rest of the talk. But I'm telling you, it worked, and it's still working. It's the best gully stopper we had among the grasses. And like Glenn said, it was also a very persistent grass. It's one of the problems now. 40 million acres of it, and it's persistent. Of course, as we've said, just another reminder, fescue toxicosis became the problem. We started noticing all these problems. I hate, we're using all these dramatic photographs, but this is probably just the common one. The animals just are lethargic, and they don't gain well, they don't produce well. It's just on and on and on. And I heard Gary Lacefield give a talk at AFGC a few weeks ago, and the estimate, you can throw these numbers around. I mean, I can be like a politician. I can throw numbers around all day long, but facts are a little more difficult. He estimated $1 billion. I'm sure it's there. I kind of did some calculations in my mind, and I came up with like $80 a head, for all the cattle in the fescue, the main fescue belt, that main belt in there. So it became dramatic. The animal problems, but it was a natural progression. Just remember, it's a natural progression. We stopped up all the gullies. We kept the animals. We had to get some use out of that land, though, once we had it. We had trees and grass, so what do you do with grass? You graze it. And then the problems started cropping up, And the better the stand, the more the problems cropped up. What we found later, of course, as we've gone through this timeline now, this historical timeline, and it was especially Charles Bacon and Joe Robbins at the University of Georgia. They were actually USDA, University of Georgia, but had joint appointments in the college. Found this endophyte. And they made a lot of associations, and then a lot of data was coming in, and by the late 70s, we were convinced that the main animal toxins that we were getting and causing the animal problems came about from a fungus that lived inside the plant. This is fascinating mutualism if you're into it. I mean, in any other context, it would be fascinating to look at it, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So what we found, of course, that Glenn just spent 45 minutes talking about ergot alkaloids, especially ergovaline. And so it's a group of alkaloids, the ergot alkaloids, that with the main one being ergovaline. The interesting thing about these ergot alkaloids is that main ring, if you've had a little biochemistry, you just attach things on the ring and it becomes a different compound altogether. Well, the main ring is an LSD ring. So right away we're starting to deal with some problem. Other ergot alkaloids, ergotamine and things like this can cause St. Vitus dance. If you can get ergot bodies in rye, in cereal rye, when you make rye bread or eat rye. The ergot bodies are about the same size as the rye seed, so they can get processed. That's why people in a rye diet, and they get into they thought the Quakers and Shakers, they ate a lot of rye, they get into a religious stupor, poop, they fall on the floor and they're shaking and quaking. But they're just hepped up on LSD probably, But anyhow, no, I don't want to say that. But it's a series of compounds, and there's a lot of them. And this will come clear as we go through the talk of what we tried to do to avoid all those ergot compounds. But ergovaline is definitely one of the main ones, and it can make up 80-90% of the ergopeptine alkaloids, which are the real problem for us. And of course, as you saw from John's thing, and I got this picture from John and Matt, you get that blood vessel constriction. Glenn just talked a lot about it. Blood vessel fescue foot in the most advanced stage. Most of the time, it's just this next one just trying to cool off, But it's you can get into the advanced stages where tails fall off and hooves fall off, and thank goodness we don't get a lot of that. But most of the time, it's just this lethargy, and poor production. And then finally, you can get prolactin levels in the blood to depress. This is some work we did, and you compare endophyte infected, good old toxic fescue with some, things with we call endophyte free, and you can see that the blood prolactin can crash. It's a very sensitive assay of toxicosis. So that's one reason we use it, to see how quickly are we already into a toxicosis. It might not be bad, but we're starting into it. And then, of course, as you get into the advanced stages, as you keep going down this continuum, it gets worse and worse and worse as you keep loading up the animal with these ergot compounds. But and now we're back to this historical context, what was the answer? But it was simple. We found out we could remove it from the seed. That made it real easy. All we had to do was kind of, just jerk around the seed a little bit, with storage and maybe run up the temperature a little bit where we didn't kill the embryo of the seed, but we could kill the endophyte. We planted endophyte free. And man, the animal work just showed, gosh, yeah, this is great. This is perfect. This is easy. We'll do it. Well, 100,000 acres later, or hundreds of thousands of acres later, the problems started cropping up. And the main problem was endophyte infected. You could get good, especially after stressful summers. That's where the real problems develop. We just had a death rate or lack of persistence, a lack of dependability. And let me tell you, You take a dependable grass like fescue and you remove dependability. That's like saying the best way to stop a left hook is to lean into it. Well, that might stop a left hook, but it's probably not the best way to stop it. So we don't want to do too much of that. And that became a real problem. You had to really manage it. It became, basically, fungus-free fescue became a plant that's more difficult to manage. You can manage it, and some people do, and it works because you're removing the animal toxins. So why is it persistent? Why is it persistent? Well, first of all, you get reduced grazing on it. I mean, especially as you get into the spring, you saw that thing John had, especially it goes into that seed head thing. I mean, the toxins are screaming, and they're eating it, and they're lethargic, they quit grazing. In our grazing studies, I was always amazed, we couldn't stock it heavy enough. You know, we were running 2 to 3 acre paddocks, and we'd have 10 animals out there, and it was still accumulating. So it's amazing. So when it accumulates, though, it becomes an insulation effect. You don't get that soil heating up because there's no light, and then it keeps other weeds from germinating. So it's putting itself in a good position to persist. The other thing is that it produces a suite of alkaloids. So we concentrate on the ergot alkaloids because they're the anti-herbivory, they're the alkaloids that hurt livestock. But there's some other alkaloids, these paramine alkaloids that are produced, also have anti-insect properties. So that's good. You know, it's like having your own little insecticide. We also found out that they produce growth hormones, IAA, GA, some of the things that people spray, you know, to promote plant growth. They produce them naturally. That's one thing we could always measure. We could get a lot more tillering and growth off our infected plants than off our endophyte-free plants. They're producing some IAA and GA. And then we even could find, in some cases, from the infected plants, better drought tolerance as we got into the summers. So this made this plant, this endophyte, is the closest thing to a super gene that you can put into a plant. Like I told the group yesterday, when it's in the plant, it's Superman. When it's not in the plant, it's Clark Kent. You know, so that's where we are with this. So it became, from an ecological standpoint, this mutualism of this endophyte and this plant made it more fit in nature. So what did the plant get out of it? All this stuff. When it's out there in the real world and it's competing against insects and drought and heat and animals trying to eat it, it's very competitive. What does the endophyte get out of it? It gets a home. A nice, tucked in, nice home where you can live there with this persistent plant. In fact, it is such a unique mutualism that you know if you know anything about fungal diseases in plants, it's like rust and cereal. They infect the plant, then they rupture and produce these spores that go out and infect other plants. This one doesn't do that. It has no reproductive stage. It lives in the plant, and the only way it perpetuates itself is it grows up into the seed and perpetuates. So you can't really reinfect a plant with the endophyte except by actually getting some fungal hyphae and sticking it in the plant. You can't really get the normal, normal infection that you get for other cereal. It's really interesting. But what was at the end of the day, at the end of the fungus-free story, or the period of fungus-free, we had the classic dilemma: animal health and production versus persistence, dependability. Now the farmers voted with their pocketbooks and their feet, and what they said was, we're not going to use endophyte-free. So we were going to have. So that made the researchers, especially, and the people who wanted to make a difference, looking at two different strategies. We're going to use infected fescue. So what can we do to help? The first one was, and you'll see a lot more about this than I'm going to go over, but management. You know, you're going to see all kinds of management strategies, everything from dilution to moving seed heads, especially those have been very effective. Of course, removing animals, feeding them something else, putting annuals in. So all kinds of management things. There's some good publications. I think Craig's going to talk about this one a little bit more. But you can get these online. You can find these how to manage and how to mitigate the problem. But there was another strategy. We took this strategy too. We even developed clovers. We had developed red and white clovers too as part of our breeding program. In fact, Durana and Patriot clovers is two we developed because we were trying to help on that side too. We knew there'd be a lot of strategies to do this, and that was just another one. But the one I'm going to talk about today is that we were developing new cultivars that had good strategies, not just our program, but several breeding programs. But we didn't want them to be toxic, and we were doing other things to try to make the endophyte free more persistent, but we just couldn't get there that we could get when we had an endophyte in it. Again, it was a super gene. I mean, we could not make it better without it. So we went a strategy. We knew that there was what we would call strains of this endophyte. If you go out in nature, you can actually find strains of the endophyte in fescue that don't produce the ergot alkaloids. And we said, ooh, we got something here. We better start looking at this. So they were naturally occurring, and we could find them. The guy, we also had developed a cultivar. It's a little bleached out, I think, but in stressful environments, it actually outperformed Kentucky 31. It was a very persistent crop, very persistent. We had given it the tag name Jessup. But we knew a lot about Jessup, and it was very persistent, again, over a wide geographic area. And so that was one of the reasons we decided to put the endophyte, these novel endophytes, into Jessup. In other words, could we take out its toxic endophyte and just substitute an endophyte in there? And which endophyte would we use? Because there's a compatibility between the endophyte and the host that has to match. It's the opposite of disease. It's kind of like breeding for disease susceptibility. You're breeding for a good host endophyte combination or a good host pathogen combination if you're looking at it like that. And we also knew that Jessup was just like Kentucky 31 in this case. If we remove the endophyte here, we got bad persistence. So we needed endophytes. We knew there were non-toxic endophytes. We had a good population. We were trying to just make the match. Now, in research, this is called proof of concept. So that was the concept. Could we put in a novel endophyte into a good population that needed endophytes? So the proof of concept was, can we use novel endophytes to remove toxins? Now this is an important thing. That's why one reason I put it in red. We wanted zero. We wanted zero ergot alkaloids. So we didn't concentrate on ergovaline or ergonovine or any. We went with the total because we still were unclear which one of those. We knew ergovaline was a big culprit, but if we are not producing any ergots, we're better off, because if every plant is zero, then when we put it in the pasture, we're starting off at a base of zero. That's an important concept because, as you saw from John's picture, remember there was a Metafescue pasture that he found 150 parts per billion. Well, let me just tell you why that is. There's 40 million acres of contamination out there. That's the contamination rate. You're always going to have a contamination rate. So what you're planting better be zero, because that'll at least slow the process down. There's always contamination out there. Hopefully you'll keep it low for a long, long period of time, but whatever you're introducing needs to be really low. So that's one reason in our proof of concept we were looking for a combination that produced, so this would be a typical setting the endophyte infected to zero. What you would have is you'd have ultimate survival in endophyte infected, toxic, but a lot of alkaloids produced. Endophyte free, less persistence, but no alkaloids, zero. we were looking for strains. These are just several of them. We looked at about 15 different strains, by the way. It's a lot of work. And one actually got the survival rate up closer to where the endophyte infected was. And here's just some pictures of the survival things. I don't know how good this is. It's just never been, with this backlighting, probably hard to see. But there's a lot of fescue here, a lot of fescue here, not much fescue here. We also got our strains from this group in New Zealand. I had met this guy on the end here, Gary Latch. Great guy. I met him at a conference in France. I was given a paper on our work with Fescue, and I was saying, oh, I showed those pictures where we showed if we take the endophyte out. He was given a separate paper on perennial ryegrass, and he had non-toxic perennial ryegrass endophytes. So I went up to him and I said, will you have any ones that'll fit in fescue? He said, oh yeah. I put my arm around him, and I never let him go till we got this all done. But the group was AgResearch Grasslands in New Zealand. That's a good group of scientists there, so they had a lot of backup science on this too that really helped. But we got our strains from them. That's why AR is AgResearch, and 542 actually became the Max-Q endophyte after a lot more. So that was Max-Q. I'm doing some blatant commercialization here. But this is the one I know the best, and this is the one I was in the development. So you got to bear with me here. Of course, part of the proof of concept thing was also we had to put them under animals, and not only just one animal, every animal group we could, and do as much work as we could. These are some lamb studies. Again, that picture keeps cropping up, and I think if you saw those lambs, there they are. This is a very effective teaching tool. You can do it with cattle too. When you just have a little polywire fence and 50 feet separate, you know right away, you people are in the animal business, you know there's something going on here. If you were just looking at this one, you'd say, it's a hot day, I'd be under the shade too. Well, how do you explain these boys over here? At the same time, same place. There's something going on. You know you're good stewards of your animals. You know you don't want them to suffer. They're suffering. But anyhow, as we continue on, what we saw was, of course, as we continue down this proof of concept, we saw that we had a situation where the blood prolactin, again, we were talking about prolactin a minute ago, it's a very sensitive assay. When we were picking up the crashing of blood prolactin in the toxic ones in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. But the main thing is that for us, our prolactin suppression mimicked the endophyte free. That's what we wanted. We wanted it to act, from the animal side, we wanted it to act like endophyte free. From the plant side, we wanted it to act like toxic. Okay? It was a simple concept. Hard to do, but a simple concept. But of course, the main thing is gain. What about gain? The main thing was these lambs were dropping off, and we use lambs too, by the way, because it's a small animal model. It allowed us to use less land and less resources to test several strains. Okay? Get into beef cattle, you're starting to do minimum 2 or 3 acres. It gets to be a big thing, so you want to narrow your stuff down as you get into the beef cattle studies. But this one was, again, but you can see the gains on these lambs in the spring. Here's the endophyte infected, endophyte free. So just what you'd expect, but what we really didn't expect is how quickly it happened. They were dropping off in their gains in 2 weeks. So this stuff was pretty hot. And again, Max-Q matching, or the AR542 matching the endophyte free. That's what we were looking for. When we moved into cattle, same thing. Hot, fairly warm day in Georgia. Here are the cattle. If you were just looking at them, you say, "What's a warm day?" But then there's just a fence. There's a Max-Q cattle out there. So when we looked at, again, gains, we're looking at least half a pound to almost 0.6 of a pound gain over the whole. And well, this is in the fall, by the way. So this was stockpiled. This is a stockpile. We were even seeing the effect in stockpile. Even though I know, that's a good strategy, just remember, the stuff is insidious. It's going on all the time. But we didn't drop off quite as bad as we did in the spring, where it's really hot. Not only the temperature is hot, but the alkaloids are hot. So, but again, the main thing we were looking for, did we match endophyte free, and were we better than endophyte infected? Body temperatures, we monitored these in these cattle. By putting an ear thermocouple in there and just monitor them all the time for at least a 24-hour period. And you could see that, what those toxic cattle did, they barely get down to early in the morning. They finally start getting down, then boom, they go up again as the day starts getting warm again. They never cool down. And as Glenn said, they use their skin to cool down. It's constricted. And what we found, too, in the cold weather, it's reversed. Reverse of that. So it's very interesting. But again, Max-Q responded like we hoped it would. We moved on to horses. Very sensitive animals, especially brood mares. Endophyte and free, we had no really folding problem. Had one folding problem in the Max-Q things, but again, the guy who did the study, Peter Ryan, said that this was just a random event. But look at the toxic ones. Yeah, all kinds of problems. Out of a very small group, just about every one of them had a problem. So again, a lot of safety trials. The worst thing you can do when you say you're developing a non-toxic fescue, it better be non-toxic, and it better be non-toxic across not only across environments, different locations, but across different animal groups too. So that was very important that we did that. We also, studies I didn't put in here, we had cow-calf studies, we had feedlot studies where we actually brought animals to the feedlot. And the only thing I learned from that as a non-animal scientist was, again, this stuff is insidious. It's like from birth to death and everything in between. It's out there, they're experiencing these things. Sometimes it's not very bad, but a lot of times it's bad. But if they've been exposed to fescue, more than likely they're in some degree of fescue toxicosis. A lot of it's mild, but some of it can be very severe. So from the Max-Q study, we were the first ones to come out with not only our proof of concept on the research, but also our, as a first commercial product. But since then, there's been several commercial products that have come out. And, you need to look at their data and see which ones you want to use. But everybody's gone after this, and rightfully so. It should work. And so this was our challenge. This was our opportunity. We hope we created an opportunity with novel Endophyte. And again, now with a lot of products on the market, we were hoping everything would be fine. Well, it brought up the challenge that I've found here. And I'd say the challenge for us now, since the development of Max-Q and the subsequent development of these new products, is that as a variety, even as a group, they're not being planted in any appreciable acreage. I'm going to show you why I say that, and this is my own little snippet of information, what I'm basing this statement on. I just got on the internet and pulled off in Oregon, big grass seed producing state, and they show their ryegrass and turf seed acres to be harvested in the 2013 to 2014 period. And I've put in red here that what they call their forage type, which would be the forage market, but designed for the forage market, was about 15,000 acres. And then what they call a Kentucky 31 and older, which would probably be just general purpose and cheaper seed, 13,000 acres. So let's just do a little math here. So just for seed production and sales from Oregon production, that's just Oregon now. There's other states that produce seed. 28,000 acres, if you add the two of them together, for the forage market, you could say could go into the forage market. At 1,300 pounds per acre, which is an average for Oregon, average seed production, Jessup will go 2,000. The turf, those turf things that you saw, these turf types, which are 110,000 acres, you can tell the turf market's a huge market. They'll go 2,500. So 1,300 is a fairly average seed yield out there. That's 34 million pounds, and then even if you just concentrate only on this one they call forage market, that's still almost 20 million pounds. That's a lot of seed. That's in 1 year. I've tried to estimate, and of course I don't get a lot of data from other companies, but everybody kind of protective of this, but I estimated during that same time we only sold 500,000 pounds out of a 34 million pound market of just Oregon production. Even if I look at estimating endophyte free, 500,000 pounds is a good estimate. Definitely, I think for both of these, it's less than 1 million pounds. So that's why I say they're not being used. Very frustrating for a breeder to have done that. We spent so much time. So the challenge then is they're not being used. There's a lot of anecdotal data of why they're not being used, but there was a great, and you'll hear from these guys today, Craig Roberts and John Andre. They did a survey after Max-Q had been on the market about 2 or 3 years, and Arc Plus was coming on the market, some others. And there were 2 things that stood out in their survey of why people are not planting, and this was 10 years ago, but it must be still true today because if I look at that data from Oregon. The process of killing and planting new, the whole process. I'm going to tell you that the toughest thing I've ever had to do in forages, talking to farmers especially, and I understand it, is tell them to kill a perfectly good green grass. That's a tough sell. Again, it's like telling them to lean into a left hook. It just doesn't make any sense to them. It looks like a lot of risk. And so that's part of the problem. The other one was the seed cost, and the seed costs are high. They're definitely high. That's just the nature of the beast nowadays. I'd say Monsanto did a lot to get everybody's seed cost up with any kind of technology. But let's go back to this. And this process too is it's more than just killing the grass. It's like, what the hell do I do with my animals while I take out 20% of my stand? Well, it's tough. And I think hopefully you'll come out today with another reminder. It's going to be you in your own operation. Can you make it work? Can you put it all together? We're hopefully going to help going down the road by showing some ways to do it, but it's got to fit your operation. Can you make it work? Can you somehow get rid of some animals or get them onto some rented land for a while and come back to your own? And, there's this always do it, but I'm going to continue on that track. Just know that I understand the problem. It's a real problem. So the challenge is then, I think though that there's a couple of things going on besides just the process. I think a lot of farmers, the reason there's a rationalization going on too. I don't think I have a problem. In other words, this is normal. Or if I do, it's probably minimal, and it might be. Or can be mitigated. So why take a risk? Why should I take a risk? I understand. That is now the challenge on a farmer level. What's the opportunity? Well, the opportunity still remains replacing that toxic fescue as much as you can. But I think it's going to require a complete cultural change in your thinking. And I think it's going to be, what are the toxic alkaloid levels in my pastures? And what levels am I willing to accept? It's the same thing when you go to a doctor. For your physical, what's the first thing they do? They're going to pull a blood sample, aren't they? Look at your cholesterol. Well, the first thing they're going to do is probably take your blood pressure. Then they're going to look at a cholesterol, screen, and if for men they're going to look at PSA, and they're going to monitor it. And when it starts getting out of whack, if your cholesterol starts getting out of whack, they're going to tell you to take some Crestor. In other words, we want to bring that same thought process into this. What are your alkaloid levels now? And what levels are you willing to accept, knowing that it does certain things at certain levels? So I think that's going to be important that we get that into your thinking. It's no different than, and we'll see in a minute, than what you do if you actually take hay samples and run for protein and things. If you got hay that's at 8% crude protein and you're feeding that, you're going to probably have a protein supplement, aren't you? I mean, just because you know that the level is not high enough. Same thing. Also, I want to make another point here. There's a cost to mitigation. Mitigation is good, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. It's just how long you do it. How long do you want to do it? A lot of them are annual costs that you just keep piling up. Here's a great study that was done, again on research farms, but I'd say they're a little more precise than you would have been on farmers, but we'll look at some farmer data in a minute. So if they looked at net return, these were economists doing this work with animal scientists, and they looked at net return on some different pastures, and actually the net return was a loss when they did toxic fescue. If it was really toxic, they lost about $60 an acre. That was their net loss. They had a loss with stocker animals. Now if they added clover, they went from a negative 60 to about a plus 20 something, $22 I think it was. That's great. That shows you the benefit of mitigation. That shows you the benefit of clover too. But just look what happened. Another set of pastures treatments that were just novel endophyte. $100 an acre net return increase. And then of course the ultimate is, and we're not, and even if we do a novel endophyte, put a clover with it because the net return went up another $50-something. So it leads me to make one statement here. It's a little controversial, but mitigation should be emphasized as a good agronomic practice. It's a dang good agronomic practice. But only as a temporary approach if you're trying to solve fescue toxicosis. It's really it really allows you to have a transition phase till you finally do replace that fescue. It is the way I'd like to see you do it. But again, your money's on the line, not mine. It's a lot easier for me to tell you that. But just know that I think if you just keep asking yourself the same question, what are my goals in my operation? What can I achieve, etc. So that goal of replacement, though, is not just mine. There's a whole grassland renewal alliance that's forming out there. They're growing. It's mainly out in the Missouri. Craig will talk about that a little bit this afternoon. But they have a main goal of replacing toxic fescue. They are convinced, as we all are in the research community especially, that it's a problem. It's a real problem, and we got to do everything we can to reduce the problem. Now, in the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about some initiatives that I'd like to see besides, in addition or concurrent with the Alliance's goals and their programs of education and seed quality control. They're trying to get better seed quality to where when you plant that expensive seed, it better have that endophyte in it. You don't want to be planting fungus-free seed and paying novel prices for it. So emphasize. I think though that we should put some other things with here, and I think again we need to emphasize more routine alkaloid sampling. So you'll have a better, just like your cholesterol and et cetera. You'll know what's going on. Define and implement a threshold. In other words, just like your cholesterol, when it gets above a certain threshold or there's certain breakdown, they're going to start putting you on Crestor. It's just because they want to drive it back down. So We need to know those threshold levels, or at least have something in your mind that's a threshold level. And then finally, I think the best way to do this is to establish a locale-specific on-farm demonstrations. And the seed industry hopefully will buy into this, along with extension and even you farmers, to put in some demos that show the value of replacement on a normal farm. In other words, I got this one here is what I normally have, and I've replaced this section, and I compare the two animal groups. That always goes over well, because it's better than experts like me talking to you, because you say, that boy's from Georgia, he don't know what the hell's going on in Virginia, and I probably don't. But I can tell you that if somebody in Virginia does it, and in your locale is on a farm, it makes a big difference. So let's look at each one of these things. Routine soil and pasture sampling. We need to do more of that routinely. I'm always amazed. First question I always ask a farmer if I'm working directly with them is, have you soil sampled? I'd say 1 out of 10 have done it recently, maybe 2 out of 10. And sometimes they've done it 2 years ago, sometimes 4 years ago, and sometimes never. So we don't even do soil sampling routinely. We should. We should do a lot more of it. Also, just looking at, just doing feed analysis on especially our hay and baleage, but also even on our pastures. What's the crude protein? What's the thing? Et cetera, et cetera. We don't do enough of that. So it's going to be a tough sell to get y'all to also add an alkaloid analysis. But hopefully we can work toward that one day. Mark McCann, old colleague of mine who was here at VPI, I got him to quote. I got a quote from him. Alkaloids need to be more of a parameter than infection level. I mean, I understand why we use infection level, but it doesn't give you that number, and we haven't achieved a lot with infection level. If I just tell you that you've got 60% infection in your pasture, you've got 60% of your pasture is infected with Endophyte. Toxic Endophyte, even if I use that word. Rather than tell you, you got 1,000 parts per billion ergot alkaloids, and 500 is about the limit. That means a lot more to you than just say, oh, I got 60% infection. Okay, that means I got 40% non-infection. I'm fine. So, again, we need to establish some threshold levels. I said 500 just then, but some people go as low as 250. And I think we need to get into where you can do this more routinely. Hopefully, maybe even we get these feed labs to maybe even add it as a, just like this one, and just get that crude protein, fiber, all that stuff. And then just, if it's a fescue sample, maybe they just tell you, okay, you got ergovaline of this. That would be good. I'm going to just go through a little animations here. I'm doing a rationalization. A great story on rationalization is two men looking at a bowl of fruit, and it's different fruit there, and one of them picks up a green pear, and he said, "This is a green pear, isn't it?" And the guy said, "Oh yeah, that's a green pear." The other guy says. And he starts flipping around his hand and finds a little yellow spot on it. He said, there's a yellow spot on this thing. It must not be a green pear, it must be a yellow pear. It just hadn't ripened up yet. And the guy said, oh yeah, it's a yellow pear. There's no doubt about it. He keeps looking at it and he said, doesn't that thing have a funny shape? It's not really a pear shape, it's a little more oblong in it. And he said, yeah, I believe you're right. I believe it is. It's definitely not a classic pear shape. It's a little more oblong. They just get there and keep talking, and then finally the guy said, if this thing is oblong and it's yellow, it must be a banana. And the other guy said, I believe you're right, it's a banana. So those guys, in a very logical and rational fashion, just made a banana out of a green pear. So I'm fixing to do the same thing. Hopefully, all I've done is made a yellow pear out of a green pear. But we did some work in our breeding program where we and this was published by my colleague, but we developed the populations. We took Jessup, the old toxic Jessup, and we bred out. We kept the toxic endophyte in it, and we just, through breeding, tried to lower the ability to produce alkaloids. So that's what this population was, and of course we had the Jessup fungus free. So when we compared total alkaloid production, and this was published in Crop Science, we had reduced the alkaloid level pretty consistently, about 47%. So now we wanted to look at what did that do? How much did we achieve by reducing it 47%? And what we found was, again, a sensitive assay, even though we were sitting around 475 parts per billion, prolactin just crashed. Didn't matter, both in the toxic, and it just acted just like toxic as far as, so these animals were still in some degree of toxicosis. There's no doubt about it. But, now the weight gain, though, was a little better story. It's about a 23% reduction in the gain we could have gotten from having no toxic alkaloids. But still, about half of what the reduction would have been if we had had toxic alkaloids. So using these data, which are real data, now I'm going to try to go to my yellow pear. There was a study by Stam in Oregon where he fed known alkaloid levels in fescue straw to animals in a confined feeding study. And he found from all his studies that he proposed a safe level of 475 parts per billion ergovaline, which I'm going to match up with about the same amount of total ergots. So that's another rationalization I'm making here. That could be a threshold. You heard John say 500. That's a nice number. I've heard people say as low as 250. Even in Stam's paper, he found blood prolactin starting to really had crashed by the time he got from 150 to about 375. So there's probably something, and in other words, he was in what he called clinical toxicosis, somewhere in that 250 to 375 range. So anyhow, I'm just saying that there's data out there that we can actually start with a number so you can shoot at it, if you want to start sampling your pastures. If we looked at the value of sampling, I think the power of John's study, all that work John did, and John and Matt did up in the Shenandoah Valley, was, I don't care. I don't care if it's at 475 or 250. Just about all those pastures need to be replaced, don't they? I mean, if you sample and you have that threshold, it's pretty clear that something needs to be done. Something needs to be done. Mitigation will help. Doing other things will help. And I understand. And just know that I do understand that your operation it's got to be fit your operation. It's got to fit your operation. So looking around, I think not only those demos we need to show you the value of it and maybe some ways to do it, but there's some people that have actually done it. There's some people who just became convinced that they weren't going to live with fescue toxicosis. This guy, Darrell Franson in Missouri, he's probably the most famous one. And he did everything. He started off with mitigation. In other words, he planted common lespedezas. He planted ladino and red clovers. He improved his calf gains with mitigation, 5-10%, just like you would see normal. But he said his foot problems didn't improve and his medicated bills had stayed high. So he just said, I got to do something. And that about the same time that. In fact, Max-Q came on the market in 2001. So he said, I stuck my toe in the water. I got these slides from Darrell. He said, and he used a smother spray to replace. And he planted the Max-Q, and then later he used some other products, Bar Optima and some others. So he did the same thing with 20 more acres in 2002, and he continued to chip away at it until 2009 when he killed the last of his Kentucky 31. He kept really good records. Darrell was a very, these Excel spreadsheets allow you to keep some pretty good records and pretty simple records. But so he started the process here, 2002, and he was through by 2009. So here, he just blocked off 5 years before he started. His average percent weaned on his calves was about 82%, and their weights was 526 pounds. By the time, it was already starting to creep up, but by the time he did the next 5 years, pretty much after he was 90% there, he had moved almost, he had moved his weaning percentage up, but look at his weaning weights had gone up about 90 pounds per calf on average. So he was convinced that it's the best thing he ever did, but he had to make it work, his operation. And again, it's going to be grower specific. Finishing up here, we're putting out some demos, Convince Pennington in this case. I hope some of the other companies will do the same thing, but going into some existing stands with farmers, working with farmers, replacing one side of a field or whatever, hopefully big enough to where we can get some good information, and leaving the existing. And here were the protocols. It's written up in that book you got. I won't go over it too much. It's just that I did in red. The main thing is you got to remove those seed heads the spring before you're going to plant the next fall, because as John will show you this afternoon, there's a lot of live over seed if you don't do that. But anyhow, also you can also use that spray, smother, spray. This was just a spray. This is a more simple one. Spray 4 to 6 weeks before planting with Roundup. Spray at planting and then plant. We get a good enough kill, but again, you can always have a contamination rate. The spray, smother, spray actually gets that contamination rate way down. But it's always there. Again, my statement of 40 million acres, that's a lot of contamination sitting out there. And it's going to come in many ways, as John will show you, from the hay. You're going to be planting it too, the cows are going to bring it in. It's always going to be there. So here's what we would consider to be a demonstrable thing. Hopefully you'll see, as you look at the replaced with the existing, you're going to probably see some animal behavior things. It's good to have a field day. I mean, farmers, this is just powerful. They see it in their locale. They see it with their climate. They see it with their soils. It's not some yahoo from Georgia coming in and saying it actually means something to them. And then if we can supplement that with some ergovaline reports, along with, we might see the same thing on, you probably won't see a lot of difference in crude protein and digestibility, but you probably will see dramatic differences in alkaloids. And then finally, if the farmer will do like Darrell did and at least get some gains, what did the animals come off weighing at, that would be very interesting. So you can do this yourself, just like Darrell did. We're just trying to. And the first ones are going in actually in the Shenandoah Valley, again, as you can imagine, with John and them having such a good database of what the alkaloid levels were and going into some pastures. And the first one is at the Shaver Farm there near Weir's Cave, and this was the spray. You sprayed it out in August. This was you can see the line there with. This is the existing. This is how it came. And this had a nice fall this year, didn't you, for growing fescue? So they're thinking about having a field day this May or June, and there's a flyer out on the desk out there where they're just looking for interest. If you're interested in coming, you've got a little tear-off thing and a drop box there. If you're interested, just to get your name, and so they can give you the exact dates, or if you do want to come to it, that'll be available too. And also you can talk to John about it. So, conclusions. Novel Endophyte fescues, I think, are the opportunity. But producer mindset is really our challenge. Convincing you that you can work it into your operation. And like everything else, there'll be some of y'all that just simply can't do it. Just simply can't do it. Here's some specific recommendations I'm making in this talk and tried to emphasize in this talk. I do want you to remember that hopefully mitigation, it's all in the book too that you got. These are good. These are good, and I definitely encourage you to do them. You don't want anything to reduce the problem. It's transitional though. It should be a transitional rescue effort before you go to replace. I think we can operate. I'd like to just throw out and say we're operating at 475 based on STAM's data, our data, a lot of other data. But just know that there's some people believe it's as low as 250. I think if you're looking at a range then from 250 to 500, if you're in that range, you're probably okay. It's just you're starting to enter into the danger zone. And again, I'd like to see more pasture sampling. It's an expensive thing, but it's like everything else. If there was a demand, and with technology now, I think you'd find the price would get driven down and the ease of getting it done it would be more rapid, et cetera. But agnostics definitely has a test. It's just a little slower, maybe a little slower than we want. And of course, if we can ever get to the ultimate, is this: anytime you send a feed sample in, if it's fescue, they would give you an alkaloid report. Or if you ask for an alkaloid report, they'd give it to you. Public and private, we need to do more on-farm demonstrations. It's just something about seeing it in your environment that makes a big difference. And again, viewing these on-farm, again, I just keep emphasizing this. They're specific for each one of you. And I'm just not going to be telling you that you've got to do it, and et cetera. But I just believe that it will really help you if you replace existing fescue with novel fescue. And then finally, these changes, again, will be difficult to implement and definitely long-term. But I like this quote from Mark Twain, is that the secret of getting ahead is getting started. Just get started, we'll just see. And of course, this will mean a lot of work and a lot of work on your part, I know. But there's a great old African proverb that I saw in Thomas Friedman's book that I think, I always tell my graduate students this anyhow, is that when the gazelle wakes up, he knows he must run faster than the fastest lion. When the lion wakes up, he knows he must run faster than the slowest gazelle. So looking out there, I don't know if you're a lion or a gazelle, but when the sun comes up, you better be running. But I always know, and I'm going to, as a grandparent and for the grandparents in the room, I think and for everybody else that's not a grandparent, it's just an overbearing grandparent. But this is my wife and my grandchildren. And I love this. I want to end up not with the African proverb, but with a quote from Waldo Emerson. And I love this thing: to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children. If you can do that, you'll probably be okay. So anyhow, that's all I've got. I appreciate your attention, and I appreciate the ability to give you this presentation.
Got some questions?
Yeah, you talk about novel endophytes. I'd like to ask you a question about antique endophytes. About 8 to 10 years ago, I read an article about grass they had rediscovered in Iowa that they called Metafescue.
Oh, yeah.
It said it had non-toxic endophytes. I've checked on it every few years. This year, the Albert Lee seed catalog in Iowa is selling 3 different types of Metafescue. So can you tell me anything about what that really is?
The interesting thing about tall fescue is that it's, his question was that Metafescue, they found non-toxic endophytes in Metafescue. So what does that mean? Metafescue is actually one of the progenitor species of tall fescue. Now, if you know wheat, if y'all know anything about wheat, especially bread wheat, or even the spaghetti wheats, there were 2 little goat grasses out there that hybridized to make the durum wheats, or the spaghetti wheats. Another chance hybridization, these are all chance hybridization, between durum wheat and another goat grass produced bread wheats, the hexaploid wheats. Now, as they kept changing from these goat grasses to the kernel just kept getting plumper and plumper. And of course, the hand of man, and mostly woman, probably started perpetuating them, and then we went from there. Tall fescue did the same thing. They're pretty sure that there was a hybridization. There's 3 different genomes in there, in other words, like in wheat. And one of those genomes is Metafescue. Now, whether the endophytes came through Metafescue or not, we really don't know. But it doesn't surprise me that if we found non-toxic endophytes in tall fescue, that we can find them in Metafescue. Yeah.
Do you think festuloleums could be beneficial in our area?
If they persist, you know, I'm a great believer in fact, you might have heard, I talked exclusively today on our program to develop fescues. But we developed crabgrasses, clovers, orchard grasses, well, just a series of plants. So I'm a great believer in a whole arsenal. I believe that all producers need we call them toolboxes in research. When you open that toolbox, you need as many tools as you can. And a variety of annuals and perennials. We even developed some cereals for grazing. So I'm a great believer in I think the main thing, though, is that does it fit? Will it persist? Will it give you the production that you need? These grasses like tall fescue and Bermuda grass, they didn't become the dominant grasses throughout the Southeast. They became the dominant grasses because they were persistent, and they're going to be there whether you want them there or not. So that's one reason we're trying to live with them. But if festuloleum will work for you and fit into your operation just like novel fescues, have at it. You know, I think it's good. Whatever works. Okay, that's a very good question. It says, if you do your replacement, what's the persistence of it? You know, or another way to look at it is, the way I'm going to put some words in your mouth here, but how much endophyte infection will reoccur? You know, so not only will you lose the novel endophyte, but will you start getting other endophytes? Other toxic fescues in. And it's a dynamic process, just like we were showing. You have this situation where there's a contamination rate always out there. I mean, since 1973, 40 million acres, that's a lot of contamination floating around out there. It's just floating in the air, you know. Our studies indicate that novel endophyte is persistent. But you got to remember, it's also very palatable. It doesn't accumulate like the toxic does it? The animals actually eat it. And if you leave them out there, they'll eat it into the ground. It's not toxic. So we found that in really stressful areas, like when we started getting into Georgia, southern Georgia, out into Oklahoma and Texas, we got to go into the summer leaving some residue. So animal management has become very important for long-term persistence. In fact, we know if we can get Kentucky 31 grazed down to the ground, we lose it. I mean, the soil just heats up. You won't believe what those soil temperatures will be if you get up to 95 degrees ambient temperature. That soil temperature could be 120, 130. It'll just cook it. So by keeping a cushion out there, you remove that. So there's going to be a lot of the simple answers. Management's going to play a role in how persistent they are. Also, the contamination rate coming in, you got to do things like don't bring in any toxic hay. I saw a great picture. I took a picture here in Virginia when I was here a couple of years ago. And I'm not accusing anybody in this room. I'm sure we're all above average here. But they just had a big rolls of hay and they rolled it down around the mountain, round the hill. That's a good way to do it. I'd probably do it that way too. Let gravity help you. And if that was what I call Independence hay, which means it was put up on July 4th, it probably had a lot of seed in it, a lot of ripe seed, and those animals just looked like they were planting it for them. You know, it's got a mulch and it's planting the seed. Next thing you know, you got a contamination rate going in. So you got to be careful. So both persistence and contamination rate will be the management things that you've got to avoid if you're going to make this work. But again, I keep coming back to if we base it on alkaloid levels and a threshold level, if it creeps back up in 10 years or 15 years, you're going to have to make another decision. Can I live with that level? Can I mitigate it, or can I just keep going? Yeah. Sorry. I wish I had a simple answer. But we're dealing with a biological system out there. And like I said, we've contaminated the system. So we got to live with it. Yes, sir.
You talked about the prospect of animal genetics dealing with it, but in analogy to your Crestor, what about the prospects of getting a supplement? I know at one point they talked about ivermectin.
Right. Yeah, they definitely work. Yeah, repeating the question, I've talked mostly about mitigation through agronomic practices, but he was asking about mitigation through pharmaceuticals, maybe even vaccines or animal breeding. There's going to be some more talked about that this afternoon, and there's some things going on. In fact, a classic one is when horses are exposed to it is domperidone. You know, they give them that pharmaceutical because it keeps their abortions down. So there's definitely some effects of those. It's just another mitigation tool. But you got to remember, all mitigation has an annual cost. Has an annual cost, where replacement is a one-time cost, at least.
Or a 10-year cost.
Yeah, hopefully. You can prorate it over 10 years, though. But anyhow, it's an annual cost. You know, it's just something that we do. I always tease the animal scientists, though. You know, the first thing an animal scientist is going to do is breed. If he doesn't get anything there, he's going to supplement. If he doesn't get that, he's going to vaccinate them, and then he's going to dose them with something. And if that doesn't work, he's going to go concentrate on his pasture.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Yep, thank you.